Okay, and one last thing about this. Can you explain what happened recently with George Aligaia?
No. What did happen with him?
Okay. He was president of the
Fair
Trade.
Sorry, yes. Well, what happened with George Aligaia was that he was wasn't allowed to be in the Fair Trade Foundation.
Mm-hmm. He said it was too political.
And the BBC said that was too political. Just like they said that the TUC advert in the late 80s urging a boycott of South African products was too political and couldn't get on. Whereas on the other hand, advertising South African Airways wasn't political at all, and so they could put that on. It's this conception, isn't it, that they can't understand what's politics and what's beyond politics. They have this narrow conception of party politics or left politics as being politics, but reactionary right-wing politics they just see as normal. That's a kind of indication, isn't it? And there's many other examples of that. So when they refused to broadcast the Disasters Emergency Committee appeal on Gaza earlier this year, leading to a rash of occupations of BBC premises across the country, starting in Glasgow, I think. They just don't understand why people are so annoyed, and it's that kind of bizarre conception where they think that neoliberal free market think tanks are apolitical somehow, and they think for the Fair Trade Foundation, which everybody agrees is quite a good thing, is actually political. So you have someone like Evan Davis, for example, who's I think he presents the Today programme now. He used to be the economics editor for Newsnight, and presents that Dragon's Den programme, that terrible nonsense, hymn of praise to stamping in the face of the poor. And he, of course, is on the board of the Social Market Foundation, which is a neoliberal think tank which promotes the privatisation of the BBC and all sorts of other organisations. And when you ask the BBC about this, they say, well, it's an educational charity. It hasn't got any strong political line. And I remember speaking to the controller of editorial policy about this. And I just sit across from him thinking, what on earth is he talking about? Which world is it that he's living in when he thinks that a neoliberal think tank funded by transnational corporations explicitly and only in order that it can promote privatisation and the role of the market and government can think that that's somehow non-political? It's okay for Evan Davis to be on the board of that, and it's not okay for George Aligaia to be on the Fair Trade Foundation. It's a parallel universe.
Yeah, also, they'll broadcast horrible things about, enemies of the state, but then just a very early example of censorship, not early, but Peter Watkin and the War Game, I think the BBC commissioned that, and then wouldn't broadcast it.
Yeah, they banned it for 30 years, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, it was too horrific. The government was very concerned. The government, in the case of nuclear, impacts of nuclear fallout, the government learned in the 1950s, I think, I read about this in that book, Don't Mention the War, that BBC were thinking of making a programme which would discuss the effects of nuclear fallout, at which point the government wrote letters to the BBC saying, you will not on any account broadcast this programme, and the BBC wrote back saying, don't be ridiculous, we're independent, you can't censor us. And then they had a meeting, and they said, come on, oh boy, you can't really be serious, we couldn't possibly, and the BBC said, no, you're right, you can't, let's put it. And there's a minute of this in the National Archives saying, it was agreed that we would put away the exchange of correspondence in the drawer, and we would have a policy, blah, blah, blah. And that led to the BBC having a policy for 20 years of making it impossible for any journalist to mention the effects of nuclear fallout.
Right, it's like...
which is a story which is not in any of the official histories of the BBC, and hardly anybody knows about.
Okay. Final point, BBC World Service. I spent a little time in Nepal, and the only thing we had was a shortwave radio, which we'd allow ourselves as a little treat. We're kind of in the jungle, but shortwave radio. So we had BBC World Service, Chinese one, the Russian one, and Voice of America, which was always good for a laugh. That was kind of what we put on for comedy, where they have their hard-hitting news debate on Voice of America. Why is Jesus so popular? Well, I think, that's the debate. But, BBC World Service, where do you think that comes into it? Because they make a big play of, in each country, there's locals employed. Is it only locals employed that are guaranteed to say the right thing, or is there certain levels of editorial independence that don't exist in Britain?
Well, the World Service is a complicated beast. The World Service is paid for by the Foreign Office, So it's part of the Foreign Office's overseas propaganda operations. Not leaving aside what the World Service actually does. Structurally, it's part of the Foreign Office propaganda operations. Okay? And now, of course, part of the rationale for that is that they like to keep it apparently independent, so that it can be, as they say, a beacon of what British democracy is all about. So, but it comes out of the propaganda budget, so it is part of that operation. But on the other hand, the World Service has historically been able to more properly represent countries overseas than the BBC internally. So you were able to say things on the World Service about Nepal or about Kenya or Malaysia or Argentina, which you couldn't say in Britain. Partly because there were country specialists there, partly because the politicians here didn't hear it, and therefore didn't complain about it, and partly because they needed to be a little bit more dispassionate, otherwise no one would listen to it. And they used to have a separate policy on how they would discuss, for example, political violence. So the BBC internally in Britain in the 80s had a policy that terrorism was an acceptable term to use in some circumstances, whereas the World Service has a policy that it wasn't okay to use. They wouldn't use it. And of course that changed under Burt, and they regularised the editorial processes, constraining the World Service more than had otherwise been the case. And it's also been the case that there's been a number of controversies about people being sacked from the World Service for not towing the editorial line. But on the other hand, it's just, they are, although they've been cut back in some respects, they are, in some respects, still more open than the internal BBC. So it's a contradictory organisation in some ways. But of course, in addition to that, all that one has to say that the World Service is, of course, used for intelligence purposes, and there are links with the intelligence services, and that's part of the history of the World Service. I think it's a kind of complicated organisation, although it's also the case that there's not really been that much in the way of research on the World Service.
That was the second podcast recorded last week at Strathclyde University with Professor David Miller, who's written several books. I suggest you read some of them, and he's also the co-founder of spinwatch.org and spinprofiles.org.